Welcome to Kellogg's Global Politics. I'm Anita, and I'm here with my co-host Ryan.
Thanks, and glad to be here.
This week has been eventful with the declaration of martial law in South Korea and the sudden collapse of the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. We analyze both events and their impact on the United States. Additionally, we look at Donald Trump's picks for key foreign policy positions and what they bode for the future.
So I know things have been busy with you at the National Defense University, and you guys are getting geared up for your kind of the industrial studies part of the year, in which you have, 20 different industry sectors that the graduate students focus on. And you're making a switch. Last year, you're in energy, and now you are going into AI or in robotics, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you feel about that?
Autonomous systems and robotics. There's a separate one for AI.
Oh, okay. How are you feeling about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. In case you haven't caught any of our past episodes, the Industrial Studies program has the students learn from talking to business leaders and other stakeholders, and they learn all about the industry, how it relates to the defense industrial base, and look for policy solutions to the problems there. So we had our first class on Thursday, and the lead of the IS program and the co-lead started with this video that totally freaked me out. I don't know about the rest of the class. Well, we were also all freezing because it was 52 degrees in there. But the video I was telling you about had these like tiny drones that could easily identify any person. And then they could explode into like a bullet into somebody's forehead.
Okay. And then when you told me about this, I was like, one, where did this come from? Two, is this something that was like, oh, this is something cool that we could do in the future for around national defense, instead of like, oh, this is a very disturbing Black Mirror-esque application of AI drones?
I think this is coming from like, this is kind of disturbing.
Okay, so it was a disturbing vibe that was being
absolutely
shared. Okay, not that, oh, this thing is cool, I can't wait till we can deploy that. Okay, that's good. Just wanted to get that right.
Because it showed all these like fake news reports of it being used by terrorists and thieves and against political opposition. So they had this one where it hunted down every student that had reshared a certain post on social media. Just all kinds of how cheap they were, so how anyone could get their hands on them, and how devastating this was eventually for society and law and order.
Okay. And from the context, it wasn't deployed, were framed as like, oh, this is some horrible tech that like the CCP will eventually deploy. This would be...
It started out with this sort of like tech bro sort of TED Talk sort of thing. And like, look at this really cool thing that we've developed. Look what it does. Look what it does to the dummy.
Yeah.
This is how we're going to go after the bad guys. He just says bad guys.
So it's like a RoboCop sort of story with some dude doing a pitch on, hey, here's this horrifically lethal autonomous robot and what it can do.
And then you saw the fake news reports of like the havoc it was having on society.
Yeah. Well, that's a powerful lead in. Then, I mean, can you share what the discussion was like, or was there any like discussion around the video? And
no, it was just presented as is.
Okay.
And then we went straight into introductions.
Okay.
I don't know about anyone else, but I was a little like, okay.
Yeah, because that's kind of a big setup. I mean, I'm expecting something as a follow-up, like just some sort of follow-up message. Oh, and we're going to be exploring all the potential downsides and dangers of this tech, and what safeguards would need to be put in place as this gets kind of rolled out into our means of warfare. Okay.
It was more of a like, look, this is the kind of tech that we're dealing with and we're thinking about, and it's not all just look at what we as the military can do, the good guys, but look at what happens to technology if it gets into the wrong hands.
Yeah.
So it's going to be an interesting course for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating topic, obviously, and very timely. And that certainly since ChatGPT made its debut and you kind of had markets in a gigantic like AI driven bubble. I mean, there's so much speculation on the effects that AI and robotics are going to have on the future. So, and definitely warfare being a huge part of it.
Yeah, and one thing I like about this is that, like I said, there's a different industrial studies on AI, and this looks at AI that's being applied to physical
Kind of
systems.
being married to physical systems,
Yeah. So I think that's an interesting kind of hands-on sort of look at it.
Yeah, and it sounds like you guys are going to visit some of the main players in that space, over the course of the semester, including Boston Dynamic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, the famed, still terrified by the robot dogs that they have, which I swear they just a direct copy from Black Mirror. I'm not sure which came from. I'm assuming the Boston Dynamic robot was debuted. Everybody's seen those in the YouTube videos, and they don't look cute even in the video. Though they paint them yellow and they kind of do little dances and things. But yeah, then the Black Mirror episode where they're used to hunt down protesters and things like that, and really savage. And they're always like equipped with like a little machine gun too. So just kind of terrifying.
Yeah,
I think there's a lot of skepticism around robotics and AI. I've certainly seen surveys where definitely older generations. I mean, it's a real generational thing. You have people our age and older that just refuse to use like AI, any of the chat like ChatGPT functions in any form. And then you have other ones in like the Gen Alpha and Gen Z who form relationships with dedicated chat bots.
So I was reading maybe a different article that was talking about one of the problems with this is chatbots tend to be self-affirming, like they affirm what you said your choices are. So this can be really harmful in like suicidal situations because it's not programmed to tell you don't do an action. It's programmed to support your decision for an action. So there's a lot of concern about that.
Yeah, there's definitely been, I mean, I think that article mentioned, a couple suicides, related to people with that. Yeah. But it's just remarkable how quickly that's changed and just how quickly that technology is advancing. So you can imagine, when that gets married up to a physical form and robot.
Yeah, so I think there'll definitely be that aspect of it. But I think it's only as good as the data it's trained on, and there's lots of problems and biases and that, and I don't know. We'll see where it takes us, but I'm trying to get the hang of AI tools myself. I don't know why I usually embrace tech things so easily, and I'm just like, Ben, I never think of using it. You're the one who's usually, why don't you try that as a prompt? And
yes, I mean, I shelled out this month for the professional version because it has a new science and math function. So you can actually help it do, basic statistical analyses. So you can feed it a data set in raw form and then tell it to conduct, a logistic regression, for instance, and then come up with interpretations and things like that. Right now, it's definitely been described as like a not very smart graduate student. And you can work through it. And I've kind of found it similar where it'll make mistakes, but then you can go back and say, okay, well, you need to look at this and this, and it'll correct those mistakes, and then it'll be fine. So I imagine within a couple of years, that's going to be extremely powerful, especially for researchers and things like that. But yeah, it does the thing that you've always complained about. It does the graphing.
I want you to make a graph.
Yeah, it can do a perfect graph. You can edit it. I think it's limited where you have to do it in Python instead of R or whatever kind of specific package you're working in. But yeah, it was pretty impressive.
Yeah. So lots of positive and scary implications for the future.
For sure. Yep.
Well, getting on to what's been going on this week, we have the South Korea president declaring immediate imposition of martial law. Just to give a quick rundown, he did so on December 3rd at 10:30 p.m. local time. Within a couple of hours, 190 lawmakers barricaded themselves inside the main National Assembly chamber with heavily armed guards who were storming the parliament, and they voted unanimously to revoke the president's decree. So the 190 included some of the president's own party, it's a majority of the 300 body, so they were able to revoke the decree. And then the armed forces began to leave shortly afterwards. Just after 4 a.m., President Yoon made a second televised address announcing that he would respect the National Assembly's will and lift his martial order. Troops returned to their bases. And by the afternoon, the opposition parties had submitted a motion to impeach Mr. Yoon. Yesterday, December 7th, he survives the impeachment vote when all of his members of his party walk out, preventing a 2/3 majority. To have gotten that majority, only 8 members of the president's party were needed to impeach the president, which The Economist and other news outlets have been initially kind of positive about, since more than a dozen of these, the president's party, had voted to overturn the martial law order. And then the leader of the PPP, Yoon's party, was amongst those who publicly rebuked the president on December 6th and said that he should not be allowed to finish his term, especially after seeing evidence that the president had allegedly planned to arrest several senior politicians, including Lee Jae-myung, the DP, the opposition party's leader, and Mr. Han himself, who's been a critic of President Yoon. So what do you think? When it was happening, I was just like, I can't believe this is happening in South Korea. We obviously both have ties to the country, and it just seemed nothing like this has happened since the military regimes in the 1980s. And
yeah, it was extraordinary. I remember thinking, because we've talked about Yoon before. I mean, Yoon's actually, strictly from like a U.S. perspective and U.S. national interest, Yoon has been very favorable. I think probably the biggest thing in terms of, affecting U.S. interests in the region is him leading the reconciliation between Japan and Korea has been very positive from, a U.S. perspective. But yeah, he barely won the election in 2022. And then, he's been increasingly unpopular. So I know domestically he was like always struggling. But then he makes this announcement and it's like, oh, and he's citing the reason that he's citing that. I mean, it seemed transparently like, okay, this is politically related, but then he's using this language around national security and North Korea infiltration and communist forces and things like that. And then I'm watching the coverage on BBC, which is the only one when it first broke out was actually covering. CNN was talking about, our own domestic issues, understandably. And BBC has this professor, I think, from Wales on there, and he's saying, there's no way that the U.S. doesn't know about this. There's no way that this was not, because the U.S. has...
I told you, I bet they didn't. It sounded
compelling. It was like 20,000. I mean, how many troops do we have? Like 20, 30,000?
30,000.
30,000 troops. The most important ally. Yeah, of course. Yeah, they're going to Yoon's going to notify the Biden administration before doing this. There's some legitimacy. It sounds nakedly political, but this is such an extreme act and so out of character, like you said, for South Korea as a exemplar democracy. So yeah, just shocked. What was Yoon thinking? There seems to be zero that this is just a sheer act of desperation on his part.
Yeah, I still think the timing is weird. So he's very unpopular with a 20% approval rating, which has gone down to 13%. I'm like, it fell to 13%. Mainly this is based on the economy. So the country's stock market is one of the worst performing in the world this year. Its currency has weakened more against the US dollar than any other major Asian currencies, and the economic growth has largely stagnated. So people are very, very unhappy about the economy. But my question is, why now? His term lasts through May 2027. So it's not like he was up for re-election, right? I don't think they can be re-elected, but it's not like there was an election happening soon or something.
Yeah, so there's no direct political pressure. We know that, he wasn't getting any of the reforms or legislation through because the opposition party controlled it. The other things I read was a lot of his cabinet members are being targeted for impeachment. And they even went after his wife around. Oh,
because there's a scandal because she was seen taking a luxury handbag as sort of for...
It was like a gift or something inappropriate around that. For the most part, normal political sort of things. But, was it driven by that? Just was going after his wife like seen as a step too far? Or it seems so... Yeah, I agree that the timing is... And then the extreme of the response without, it seems like having much buy-in from the military itself, which is probably the critical component.
But
in your own party, I guess.
It did have the buy-in of the defense minister, who then resigned that morning.
So the civilian defense minister, but not the actual military leadership.
It's unclear of how many in the military were part of the decision-making or supported this. It's just not known. It's not really known. There's about 10 people that are thought to have participated in the decision-making or knew about it, that it was going to happen.
Yeah.
But it's still not settled exactly who those people were.
It just seems extraordinarily half-baked. If you're going to attempt something like that, I mean, I guess the hope was that you successfully secure the legislation or the legislature building and prevent them from getting the vote. But at the same time, my understanding is none of the forces that were sent in actually had weapons, but they had blanks where they were not prepared to shoot any legislation. So they weren't prepared to use lethal force, even though this is supposedly, this communist takeover. But it's just so nakedly BS and political. It just is like, it seems unbelievably desperate and kind of pathetic.
I mean, you would think this action would only be taken if there was something going to come out about Yoon, that he would lose power.
Right.
I mean, why else would you do it? Although no article that I've read suggests that there is anything imminent that was coming out about.
Yeah, and the opposition certainly had. I mean, this would be the time to unveil it. If there was something like, we had been investigating him and he's guilty of X, Y, and Z. But that doesn't seem to be the case. So it doesn't seem rational. It doesn't seem rational at all. So I don't know what was going on in his head of like what the best case scenario was.
Yeah, it's really unknown. Of course, there's massive protests that are planning on continuing until he leaves office. The opposition said that they'll vote every Saturday on impeachment until he leaves office. There's question of who exactly is in charge right now. So I found this kind of disturbing. There's uncertainty who's in charge, including over the military, because Han Dong-hyun, who I mentioned to you before, of the president's PPP party, has presented himself as the government's decision maker and said the president is no longer running the country. So saying that the president has been excluded from like all the meetings and from actually making decisions. The problem is that South Korea's constitution doesn't allow for anyone to replace the president unless he resigns or is impeached. So Mr. Han is saying he's in charge, he's making the decisions, but there's no constitutional role for that happening.
Right, yeah.
So why did Han not support the impeachment process? So people think that he's trying to buy time. So instead of impeaching Yoon immediately, to wanting more of an orderly resignation with a little bit of time to improve his own chances of winning the election to select Mr. Yoon's successor. The thought is that a quick impeachment would give the edge to the opposition party, Lee Jae-myung. I found this kind of disturbing. You have Kang Won-taek, professor of political science at Seoul National, we have a situation where the president cannot make decisions, he cannot give guidelines, he cannot give orders. Although we have a president, we are in a state of anarchy.
That's, deeply concerning, obviously, from a national security perspective. I don't know how the North is viewing this. I mean, they've clearly dedicated at least some of their better forces to the Ukraine operation, so maybe that's the only good thing is that maybe they won't read this as, the moment of weakness. I mean, you always have the U.S. backing kind of that too. But yeah, it's pretty extraordinary that they don't have. I mean, I guess this is when the system is tested, kind of stress test, you really find like the weaknesses within whatever is kind of spelled out constitutionally, and then what's kind of left up to norms. And I mean, similar obviously to the U.S. and the gaps that we have.
What's so weird about this is the Constitution clearly gives the president the power to make these decisions, but the party head is declaring that the president is not, in fact, making those decisions, that he is instead. Yeah,
and there seems to be like no basis for that.
Right.
The guy just can't declare, hey, I'm the one in charge when there's no
but he's
mechanism of
implying that was some sort of agreement between him and Yoon for them not impeaching the president.
I assume they have a court system that can, or he can bring, he can have some sort of accountability that, because it creates the condition of the military of like, who's our commander in chief? Who are we listening to?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a major constitutional crisis. But impeachment is not the only way to get rid of him, also him resigning. But the opposition parties are also calling for his arrest, asserting that the president and his followers in the government and military committed insurrection and other crimes. They sent soldiers and police officers into the National Assembly to try to siege the legislature.
Yeah, I don't see where they stand on that. The declaration of martial law, technically everybody violated that because it was so broad. I mean, martial law was the ban of all political activity. And thank God, the citizens of Korea and their representatives ignored that.
It's weird because it's the ban on all political activity, but in the Constitution, the national.
I know it didn't make a lot of sense. But sometimes I guess laws don't make sense. You ban political activity, but the National Assembly should still be able to have the final say to veto and remove martial law.
Which is in the Constitution.
Which is good that that's there and that they had that outlet.
Well, it's saying that, and this is, I think, from the New York Times, a team of more than 60 prosecutors and investigators have been put together to investigate the accusations of insurrection. And that earlier on Sunday, prosecutors detained Mr. Yoon's former defense minister, Kim Yong-hun, for questioning. So, I mean, they certainly are proceeding it. Past South Korean presidents have been arrested and convicted. They don't have the same sort of prohibition on not trying a current president in office.
Yeah.
The previous conservative president was impeached after she was convicted of bribery charges.
Okay. So she was actually tried and prosecuted while in office and then impeached. Yeah, that is a big difference.
Huge difference. Yeah. Can you imagine? I mean, for something like bribery, we would never, ever get a bribery trial for any city.
We can't get any sort of trial in active president.
Anything.
So, yeah, that is now settled law, at least with this court it is, in its current composition.
Yeah, it's pretty messed up. So a really disturbing situation. Obviously, we have such a large presence of military in South Korea. Like you said, Yoon's been actually very good for the U.S. And another thing is that he's the one who's helped send military equipment to Ukraine, where the opposition wants to get rid of that.
Yeah.
So there's reasons for the U.S. to want the conservatives to stay in power. On the other hand, there was already kind of tension in the relationship because of Donald Trump taking office. And if he would enact tariffs against Korean goods, U.S. is South Korea's largest export market, overtaking China when we started banning certain semiconductors that Korea can no longer sell to China.
Yeah.
So a lot of people are finding this also like having this political confusion and constitutional crisis at a time when you need to be establishing this relationship with Trump and dealing with these delicate tensions is also a big problem. Yeah,
it's really not clear, kind of what direction this will go. I mean, it seems like he's getting impeached eventually. That I just feel like the public pressure, the fact that his approval ratings in the teens, the talk of potential more economic damage in terms of big strikes, until kind of the will and he's formally removed from office.
I think his party will still pressure for resignation first. And if they really can't get that through, when they get frustrated, then they may vote to impeach. But they have to defect to impeach.
Yeah, and I guess I'm struggling a little bit with, I guess because there's no clear succession of power. He resigns, then does the head of the party then become the
prime
acting
minister?
President?
Prime minister.
Prime minister. But Yoon is the president.
Yeah. And the president...
Who becomes president?
Oh, the prime minister takes interim power.
Okay.
And they hold an election.
A new election is then forced because of that. I gotcha. And that's obviously going to favor the opposition. I mean, I think they're deluding themselves, his party, that you're the bag holder in this sort of economy and situation. There's no situation where you're going to be able to spin it, where you're going to be competitive in this coming election. You're going to get swamped, probably.
Now, the interesting thing is the opposition leader has also recently been convicted on bribery charges.
I think that's the thing with Korea. I mean, there's certainly flip back and forth between these parties, and both being pretty unpopular. Wow, that sounds real familiar. Both are very unpopular, and then people increasingly frustrated by inequality and economic situations. Korea, I think, is facing a more dire situation than we are, and certainly the model of their growth previously, driven by exports, has now fallen apart. And then the demographic situation far worse than the U.S. Yeah, they're in a tough situation. This is not a sort of short-term solution that's sitting out there for them, I think.
No, definitely not. And if Yoon does get impeached, he'll be the second conservative president in a row to be impeached. I mean, you'd think that this would be pretty destructive for the party in general.
Yeah, and you know what? It still shocks me, that approval rating, because I think the one thing, I thought Korea had really imported more of the cultural war issues, because a lot of it was framed similar to here, where it is this divide with the genders. And the Conservative Party had this, this is the reason that young men are struggling within the employment markets, because women are, these educated women are taking their jobs. We need to put them back in the kitchen, and just really sexist sort of things. But the fact that even your core group has abandoned you if you're at 13%, you would never see that in the U.S. I don't know what, let's say, either a Biden or a Trump would have to do to get to 13% other than usher in Great Depression 2 or World War III, where we lose. I don't know how that would happen. I don't know. We're so locked in just from the cultural war issues that you could not see a swing of popularity go that low. There's always like a floor for both parties, I think.
Yeah, I think that's true. The other thing I was thinking about, I mean, this is not good for the U.S.
No, to have one of your main core allies in the region falling apart like this and having this crisis during this very sensitive time with China and transition. And it's not good.
Well, and then if the Conservative Party is destroyed, it's the Conservative Party who agrees with the U.S. agenda. The opposition doesn't want cooperation with Japan. And in fact, under the previous more liberal leadership, there was
probably wants
a trade war between Korea and Japan. They want more engagement with North Korea. And like I said, they do not want weapons shipped to Ukraine.
Yeah, that was always the thing that worried me about Yoon and his struggles domestically. It's like, this is a fantastic partner selfishly for U.S. interest, but he's not getting the job done domestically. Yeah, and then to pull this stunt, a disaster.
Yeah, and like you said, tough. I mean, because the opposition leader doesn't have his hands clean either, right? He is appealing his conviction, but it's unclear of exactly what would happen because of his conviction over these bribery charges. I mean, so you don't have great choices. I mean, your other side is a convicted felon. Sounds familiar, but...
Yeah, no, and it seems like it could be an opportunity for China to, I mean, especially if you layer on like trade war stuff, if, Korea is end up targeted through Trump's tariff program, or Japan somehow positions itself like better with the U.S. so it doesn't get targeted as much as Korea, then there's opportunity for China to kind of come in and help create a wedge between U.S. allies there.
Yeah, so all disturbing things that are really ongoing, breaking news almost every hour about this, and as well as our next topic, which is the collapse of the Syria's Assad regime.
Yeah,
I mean, literally hourly updates.
Just absolutely extraordinary how quick this happened. And we're recording this on Sunday, December 8th. And woke up this morning to see that Bashar al-Assad has resigned and fled the country to Russia after just an extraordinary turnaround in the 13-year civil war that's been going on, with rebel forces just sweeping through all the major cities of the country and then reaching the capital of Damascus, essentially this morning. So it represents the end of al-Assad's dictatorship rule. That family's controlled the country since the early 1970s. And it was something I think pretty much nobody saw coming. It's interesting. The Syria, obviously, the U.S. had involvement in the 2010s. This was, of course, the site of Obama's famous red line around chemical warfare.
That's all I knew the Syrian conflict from is the controversies under Obama. I kind of thought Assad had just won, like de facto won. So when I heard like this week that, these opposition forces are closing in close to Damascus and just having this amazing victories, I was like, I didn't even really know that there was much happening in the civil war at all.
Yeah, it had essentially been static since probably 2018, 2019. And yeah, you're right. The Syrian government forces, Assad, backed by Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah, had won. I mean, there were plenty of articles been written over the last couple of years, what a great strategic victory this was, particularly for Russia, which had, because the U.S. refused to enter the conflict. I mean, you had at the time, like John McCain was pushing for it, but it was never clear, especially after Iraq, what U.S. interests were in the conflict, who we would partner with. Because frankly, it's a hodgepodge of different forces of various radical nature, a lot of, Islamic-based forces. We have our Kurdish allies sitting in Syria. But there's never a clear impetus besides the one thing. We still have a small base there of 1,000 troops, and they're strictly to contain the remnants of ISIS, because you still have a patchwork of ISIS forces that are kind of the desert eastern region of Syria. And then there's a very significant number of prisoners that I think with our allies within Syria that are held there. So there's like 40,000 ISIS forces / prisoners in the area that if we pulled out, they would be released essentially into the wild. It was something that Trump talked about pulling out of completely, but he was talked out of because of the backsliding around ISIS, that he was convinced not to do that. But yeah, there's still 1,000 U.S. special forces within the region. They are strictly for ISIS containment.
I didn't know that about the U.S. forces. I've just been really taken aback. I know it's complicated because of the faction was once part of al-Qaeda. They broke ties in 2016, but how this sort of Islamic terrorist group, I mean, I think we consider them terrorists, right?
Yeah, the U.S., So the group is called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and we'll just call it HTS going forward. But it's a Sunni Islamic group that was formerly an al-Qaeda affiliate that broke away in 2016. But essentially, it's held this province of Idlib, which is in northwest Syria and borders Turkey. So they've held this territory the whole time since the end of the main civil war. And actually, most of Syria still is like carved up into different factions, but the main cities were held by the government. So in terms of the economic power and the worth, the centers of power are all held by Assad until this last 10 days. In this intervening time, so this group, HTS, they didn't have a lot of ties to foreign powers, but the one they did have was in Turkey with Ankara. And Turkey had provided some limited military support. There was a Turkish base there, including artillery, which helped keep any incursions by Syrian forces, because you would have occasionally attacks on HTS by Assad during this intervening time since most of the conflict winded down, including like Russian airstrikes. I mean, that was the biggest thing. The biggest difference that Russia made was that it lent its naval and air force to the Syrian regime, combined with Hezbollah ground troops. And these were like the core components that were keeping Assad propped up, and really what won the original civil war for them. But they could never contain all of these individual little territories, because you had the Kurdish territory, which was semi-backed by the U.S., our allies from the Iraq war. Turkey, of course, that's their biggest concern around Syria, is this independent Kurdish nation forming, because they have a huge part of their population that wants to be independent. So if you have like this still autonomous region in Iraq dominated by the Kurds, now with this situation, nobody exactly knows what's going to happen. I mean, HTS, this group, this Islamic group, took over all of the major cities at this point, but you still have a lot of non-affiliated factions that control huge amounts of Syrian territory. Now, they did work together kind of in the overthrow of the Assad regime, but it's not clear what sort of agreement in terms of like partitioning, or if it'll still exist. So you have like these open questions. But it seems like if anybody's gained from this in terms of foreign powers, it seems like Turkey has a significant amount that it's gained, because it did back this force. It was, some people are reading in that Turkey was negotiating with Assad around refugees, around the Syrian refugees. Because if we remember from the Civil War, huge impact on Europe and a huge impact on Turkey has been the number of refugees coming out. So there's 3.5 million Syrian refugees currently in Turkey. It's creating a lot of political issues domestically within Turkey. And they were trying to get, when can we return these back to Syria? When can we return these back? So a lot of people think that Turkey gave the go-ahead to HTS for this offensive. And nobody thought it would be this successful. And I think the thing that this points to is that what I've read is it's not so much the Russians, because obviously the Russians are distracted and all the resources being drained.
I was going to ask you about that. When I was reading about this last night, it was talking about just the day before the Russians had all abandoned. And then it was talking about the Iranians leaving too. And why were they leaving? Were they leaving just because the odds were so against them, or because they couldn't commit to the regime in the way that they had before because they're fighting the war in Ukraine?
I think things are moving so rapidly. Now, Russian ground presence was never big.
Right.
What the Russians did gain from supporting the Civil War is they expanded. They had always had, which I didn't know, they had always had this naval base on the Eastern Mediterranean. Okay. And that emerged from the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. Somehow the Soviets gained like this access to the Eastern Mediterranean. So because they supported Assad, they were able to expand this base, but then they added an air base as well. But that wasn't sufficient. They didn't see air power and naval power sufficient to support what was going on the ground. What I've seen most analysts describe it is because Hezbollah was destroyed. Its capacity was so destroyed by the Israeli offensive from a month and a half ago, that they didn't have, without Hezbollah fighters backing up the Syrian army, that just collapsed. So it was really propped up by the Iranian proxy Hezbollah.
Wow.
But yeah, just an absolute. So yeah, you had, I think Iran really, we can talk about this maybe later with the Trump appointees, but Iran talked about Iranian weakness. I mean, this just really emphasizes it a lot, and just how that period of a month where Israel just seemed to carry out one extraordinary operation after another, obviously with U.S. backing, intelligence, and operations, that it has completely changed the picture within the Middle East. And this really emphasizes it. It was interesting going back. I was reading these articles from 2018 through 2022 about Russia, and how this moment that Russia committed relatively little force, but it gained so much power and confidence by being in Syria, because it was such they invested hardly anything, and they got this extraordinary benefit. They put in like major bases. Diplomatically, they were seen as like a major global player, because this was shortly after Obama dissed Russia and said, well, as a regional power.
Oh, I see.
So I'm sure Putin took personal offense. I think Obama was just pissing off both Trump and Putin around roughly the same time frame in the second administration. He was just like low-key dissing everybody that's come major blowback during the subsequent years. But yeah, so Russia was gaining all of this. There was even, they reinstituted something from the Stalin era, which I didn't know about, where they had a train that ran from Syria that had just like all this captured equipment, like a captured U.S. Humvee, captured just all this sort of stuff. It was run through Russia all the way up to Moscow. And people in Russia would come out and there'd be celebrations around all this great military victory that Russia helped escalate to crush terrorism, because that's how it was framed. It was framed as we're crushing Islamic terrorism and, oh, look, we're a major world power again. And now you've just seen this complete reversal. And I don't think it's clear. I don't think Russia will be able to work out a deal to maintain these bases. And if it loses its the thing that's held since 1967, that's a major power loss too, because that was a way they challenged NATO in the Mediterranean. This was their one outlet. They lose that outlet, they lose their air base, they no longer are like a major player in the Middle East potentially.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe Putin's calculation is that you compensate for that by taking over Ukraine.
Yeah, if you're given that. But yes, I was thinking about how does this affect the negotiations? Mm-hmm. So let's assume we talked last time about what we're calling, even though Vance didn't dream this up because Vance said it on some TV program. I don't remember. We'll call it the Vance plan. I mean, the Vance plan essentially is to offer up to Russia the existing territory that it occupies, have a DMZ in place. But can Russia accept? I don't think Russia's going to be even more reluctant to accept, because it's now going to be feeling a little weaker for sure. Mm-hmm. This is probably the weakest it's been since, maybe Wagner rebelled and was like heading to Moscow. I mean, this is a major blow to Russian prestige. It's taken some of the heaviest losses in the war. It has part of Russian territory still occupied. I mean, Ukraine's in bad shape, but Russia's also in pretty bad shape. I just see it as there's no way in hell they're going to accept anything close to the Vance plan. I think ultimately them coming out, and it just seems less and less like Trump's going to be able to get away with fully selling out Ukraine completely, just something that results in a clear, humiliating defeat. But maybe I'm wrong. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think those are all really interesting points. I mean, it makes sense to me why Russia would be less willing to take current boundaries. It was never really clear that Russia would accept current boundaries, that it felt like it would need to. So it seems maybe even less now. I mean, no matter what, Putin can always turn this into a great victory for Russia, the Ukraine, whatever he gets out of Ukraine. He can control the narrative, but I think he wants the whole thing.
I don't know. I think he has staked it out because again, the Russian terms are they annex these 4 oblasts. Mm-hmm. So they want the entirety of the oblast. They do not occupy all of the 4 oblasts. Mm-hmm. They want Ukraine banned from NATO membership, and they want Ukraine disarmed. Mm-hmm. That's that last one. If that's a term, there's no way. Yeah. There's no way. So it just seems like they're in a more vulnerable position. So they're going to be even less maybe they weren't willing to negotiate in the first place beyond these terms that I've kind of laid out. But it seems like with this loss, let alone what could happen to Iran in this period.
Yeah.
And maybe we can get into that now, like where Iran sits, because I know they've been and certainly put in a bit more of a conciliatory tone, maybe interested in, trying to engage with the Trump administration on negotiations. But it seems like blood is fully in the water. Mm-hmm. You have enough people, including some of the people we talk about, that have always wanted to go after Iran. Now, Trump's not one of them, but you do have enough within that administration where they would be salivating, including Netanyahu and the hardliners in Israel. Why not take this shot at ending the Iranian regime?
Yeah, I think, we've talked about this. The more and more Iran shows weakness, that the more this becomes more likely. There's the thing that Trump will still not want war, and there's the possibility of this getting messy like the other wars.
Oh, for sure. For sure. I'm not saying this is a good idea, but I think it becomes Iran's telegraphed such weakness that at minimum, wouldn't they take the opportunity to try to destroy the nuclear program?
Right. But it's a conflict that could get messy. And I don't know that Trump wants his name on something that gets messy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it does come down to kind of, yeah, his willingness. He's certainly pushed for peace. I just don't know if, I think it is ultimately Netanyahu will listen to Trump, where Netanyahu does not listen to Biden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is an action, unlike against Hamas or Hezbollah, that they have to do with U.S. support. They can't do it alone.
And then from Iranian perspective, I'm thinking, I need to do the friggin' Manhattan Project. Not that they need that, but they need to have the most clandestine, undetectable development of a nuclear weapon and test as quickly as possible, because that is your only chance of long-term survival. You're in a very, very bad position currently as a regime.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just interested in the way it changes the power balance, where you did have Iran just be this major power that Saudi Arabia and other countries were concerned about and kind of positioned themselves against. And now you have an Iran that doesn't have the same power anymore. And that's happened relatively quickly. I changed my mind on whether the U.S. will go to war with Iran like daily. But right now I'm feeling pretty good about saying that Trump won't want a war with Iran.
I think you're probably right. They'll certainly want to, they'll implement maximum sanctions. And then ironically, I mean, maybe they will try to pursue a nuclear deal. That was the thing they pulled out of, that they would try to pursue. And Iran and its desperation, even though knowing that long term, I mean, I guess it buys them time. That's ultimately what the deal would be, to buy them time and to ease, I guess, these new sanctions. I mean, I don't know how effective the new sanctions will be, but.
Yeah, but that was the acquisition of why the last deal was bad, is that it allowed Iran to bide its time.
Yeah, so I don't know if they ever get into any sort of agreement.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe they enter negotiations.
Yeah.
And maybe that buys them time to carry out a clandestine nuclear program.
Yeah.
But I don't know how you actually get away with that. I don't think you can actually do a clandestine. I think they're so penetrated intelligence-wise that there's no way they can do this without Israeli Defense Forces finding out.
Yeah. So it's a very volatile situation, as the Middle East always is. I mean, what do you think? So here's this organization that we've named a terrorist organization in charge of Syria now. What do you think this means for the U.S.?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, on the surface of it, is kind of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. This is a great strategic loss to Russia and Iran. That's good. The U.S., and then with this organization, now the things I've read about HTS is, they are a very conservative Islamic group. They have set up within this province that they controlled, government sort of services, and they seem to respect minority rights. This is a Sunni organized. There's a lot of Shias. One of the things that Iran requested from HTS and they agreed to was, and it was always framed in Iran, is that there's some very important Shiite religious sites within Syria. So HTS has agreed, full protection of these and for Shia worshipers to be able to visit these sites. So they're seen as much better than like an ISIS or a Taliban, but at the same time, they are very fundamentalist Islamic regime and would want to implement a Sharia law type basis for governance. They have had to tone down also to be able to work with, because they've had to coordinate with other anti-Assad forces. So we mentioned the Kurds before, and then the small force that the U.S. has kind of in the southeastern part of the country. But it's not clear, like they're clearly the ones driving this military victory and will be the ones forming a government. It's not quite clear. The existing prime minister of Syria has actually stuck around the country, and it's agreed that HTS will not kind of intervene with him and that he's kind of the steward until a decision is made on like whatever HTS forces. I'm sure there's not about open election or anything along those lines. So yeah, I have not read anything on what exactly this means. But obviously, given the history, given that was an Al-Qaeda faction, they've toned it down some, but still, this isn't like this isn't even like a secular, it's not a secular military ruler
Right.
taking over, which probably be the U.S.'s best case.
Yeah.
It is somebody that Turkey backed, that's secular, that establishes some sort of military dictatorship and is generally favorable to
Create stability.
to the U.S. And no, this is still, I think, a big question mark. But as a Sunni group, I guess allied with, the Gulf states. So it certainly seems like it strengthens, if you can couple Saudi normalization, it definitely strengthens the Sunni Israel Gulf state U.S. alliance within the area.
Yeah, so those are interesting developments. We started talking about Iran, and so that made me think about one of Trump's first picks on the foreign policy side, which is Marco Rubio, who is a noted Iran hawk. The articles that have been written pretty much since he has been nominated talk about how he was initially extremely hawkish, argued vigorously against any economic turn inward, and holding foreign policy to adhere to longstanding American values. And how he shifted quite a bit to survive in the Trump-dominated Republican Party, including voting against Ukrainian aid earlier this year and arguing that the U.S. was funding a stalemate and needs to be brought to conclusion, but he's still hawkish on China, Iran, and South America. So you have this quote in here: in all likelihood, Marco Rubio will be less a leader and more of a follower if he becomes America's next Secretary of State. So is that what we pretty much expect, that Rubio won't really have that much independent influence and that he will just be a Trump lackey who has a little bit more respect in the establishment than some of other Trump's picks?
Yeah, no, I think that nails it. I mean, I think we have to remember that from the first Trump administration, it always came down to what Trump thought.
Mm-hmm.
There's nobody running their own little, he's not delegating these sort of things out, core positions or policy. So I think it is always going to reflect kind of Trump's will. Now, mind you, Trump's will can change on a dime, depending on who last spoke to him. So I think the hope is that has Rubio built up more credibility? Well, clearly he has, from where he started off as Lil Marco, calling Trump a fascist or whatever during that 2016 Republican primary, to the point where, he's been credibly nominated as the Secretary of State. And I think you're right. Yeah, he is very much one of the more comforting picks.
Mm-hmm.
Because of those views that you talked about in the 2010s. I mean, these are just like core Republican standard foreign policy views.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how much hope to hold out around Ukraine and negotiations that Rubio is going to be a more sensible voice that can pull back. I mean, I think the greatest thing with that is arguing around Trump's ego and not trying to create conditions where Ukraine collapses, where it's just obvious to everybody that you negotiated such a bad deal that this will be seen as a humiliating failure and will reflect badly on Trump. So I think anything that results in Trump looking good has to preserve Ukraine, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's
what we're hoping. That's, I think, what everybody is hoping.
I don't know how you don't look good, because the Ukrainian, I think, still within the majority of Americans and certainly around the world, they're fully justified. This is a sovereign country invaded by an aggressor whose territory has been taken. So to see them fight this hard in this committed a manner, this heroically, to preserve the majority of their country and not to back them on having a future where that sovereignty is preserved. I just don't see how you can fully that. I mean, I know the cynical thing is Trump's a fully bought out Putin stooge. I mean, you see that in left circles, constantly, that he's just an agent of the Kremlin, and that, of course, he's going to sell out to his buddy Putin. But I don't think that's the case. I don't think there's comptocrat or whatever. One, I don't think Trump can be compromised. There's no existing information that could ever compromise Trump. He could kill somebody on Fifth Avenue. Nobody would care.
As long as he was president at the time.
Well, definitely. That's fully a presidential act, according to the Supreme Court. He can shoot whoever he wants. But yeah, I think Rubio in those situations can frame it around the ego of Trump, and maybe because I think his core positions are what he expressed in 2010. I think at his core, he still believes that. He's just playing the game. They're all playing the game to some extent. I mean, some of them believe America first, but I think it's a very small number that actually believe that.
But does he have the freedom to speak any of those
I don't know. I don't know what relationship he's built up at Mar-a-Lago and what goes on. It's obviously enough of a relationship that he's in this position that he's in, which is more than I thought.
Yeah.
So that's something. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it was disappointing to see him and his vote on, I'm sure it helped him get the job.
Yeah.
Against Ukraine funding in the spring. I mean, I was pretty shocked by that.
Yeah, and just going back briefly to our discussion on Iran. I mean, I think Rubio would push hard to go against them at this time of weakness. I think it'll just be Trump not wanting to be entangled. Rubio won't have much influence over the decision. But that's my take.
I agree. Yeah, that one's an interesting because you have these like kind of core America First guys and then all these veterans that are now going to make up, I mean, between Vance and Hegseth and others that fought kind of in these failed wars in the aughts and 2010s in Iraq and Afghanistan. But at the same time, maybe I'm mistaken, but I think Vance is still pretty hawkish towards Iran. And then we know Hegseth is just because he's against Muslims in general, I would assume would be anti-Iranian. So it's a little bit weird, but I agree. Yeah, Trump's instinct is to make a deal and to have peace. I think he is at his core, it doesn't like the uncertainty that a war would deliver.
Yeah. Or have his name on part of what would be another mess in the Middle East.
Right. Yeah.
So here's a name that I'm still not that familiar with. Michael Waltz being named as a pick for National Security Advisor. So what do you have about him?
He's a 3-term Florida congressman. Before that, he was a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. As a Green Beret, he was quite decorated and well-respected within the service. I think he is seen as again, a more establishment sort of pick, even though, he has always been kind of aboard the MAGA train. I think he's known for intellectualizing a bit MAGA America First policy, but is still, I think, seen as more of in alignment with Rubio. And that at kind of the core, there's still that American primacist sort of belief that, America has this unique role within foreign political affairs. I know in the Economist article mentioned he had, and I think we probably discussed this in an earlier episode, but wrote a essay with Matthew Cronin, who's a Georgetown professor, that kind of alluded to the need to pivot away from Europe and the Middle East and free up all kind of military assets for the confrontation with China. So I think he is a bit more of the pivot towards Asia, which is very kind of dominant theme, even not within the isolationist MAGA, but within that MAGA group that's just like, we need to be 100% focused on destroying the CCP. So he's definitely taken some aggressive stances there. I think the other thing that some people within NATO are concerned about is that he's pretty skeptical of NATO's capabilities. And this is based on his experience as an officer within Afghanistan, where he just made a lot of comments that even the special forces sent from other NATO countries just were really lacking in combat capabilities compared to the US. Now, NATO's, concerned about that this view is like way outdated. Because this is like citing examples from the 2010s or early aughts in Afghanistan that NATO's capabilities are improved since then. But there is the kind of that skepticism, which obviously Trump shares, around NATO's worth, as in terms of their capability in pulling their own weight.
I wonder what will happen about NATO. Will Trump we've talked about this in the last episode, but how I think his pick to NATO as well was a huge skeptic of NATO power. And I can't remember his name. But what steps can Trump do to weaken the alliance in a permanent way? Or will it just be sort of frozen to be rekindled by a more favorable administration?
Yeah, I see it as being frozen. I mean, I think they'll definitely use this to try to force more concessions and force these governments to spend more on their own defense. And we'll see what emerges, if a Ukraine deal emerges. I know a core part of the Vance plan wasn't the NATO, although it's NATO members essentially manning the 6,000-mile border between Russia and Ukraine. So it would imply that countries like Germany would have to actually meet their commitments. I mean, they've certainly, and of course, Germany is going through its own thing politically right now. And it's made commitments verbally to increase its spending above that 2% threshold. But any sort of agreement where it's going to actually have to support like a European force, technically not NATO force, to ensure the peace between Russia and Ukraine, maybe that helps kind of justify NATO in a roundabout way. I don't know. But I don't see him like pulling out completely. I don't see that happening. I see this as kind of posturing and trying to make them pull more of their weight as individual countries.
Yeah, I concur. I mean, what pulling their weight means is a question, I think, since so many of them meet the 2% GDP.
Yeah, everybody in Eastern Europe already meets it. It's just Germany's still lagging behind. All your Belgium, Netherlands are definitely lagging behind. I think France is close to meeting it, but it may even, and I know Spain's definitely lagging behind, maybe even Italy. So it's basically, it's Western Europe's lagging behind. Eastern Europe, which fully recognizes the threat that Russia poses, has been spending 3% or more actually on its.
So another notable nominee is David Perdue for the ambassador to China. Kind of an interesting pick. He's had some very heated rhetoric towards China. In an article in the Washington Examiner, to protect ourselves, Americans first have to realize the CCP is actually at war with us, depicting China as a country intent on destroying the U.S. In September essay, he said the Chinese government aims to do us harm as well as destroy capitalism and democracy. So with these public stands, how much Chinese officials will be willing to work with Perdue is a question. But I was listening to a Wall Street Journal, their morning report, as I do in the car on the way to work sometimes. And there's kind of mixed, because some people think that he actually, despite this rhetoric, he might be more pragmatic when it comes to actually working with China, since he lived in Hong Kong for 2 years. He has a lot of economic ties of dealing with Chinese businesses. And so I think there's the hope, at least, that he might be more of a pragmatist in actuality.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. His instincts are definitely more pragmatic. But what I've read is that pragmatism of his past may reflect his ability to actually win confirmation as ambassador, because he's going to be seen as too soft. Because his background, I didn't know this at the time, but he was the former CEO of Dollar General. That whole place is stocked with nothing but Chinese goods. So, I mean, yeah, I think there's like a quote about offshoring, and he was like, yeah, that's what I've done my whole career, is offshoring. And Dollar General exists because China exists as a manufacturing powerhouse. So, yeah, I think his instincts, the fact that he took Beijing's position during the Hong Kong protest. People are going to look at this at, kind of his previous commercial ties and be like, this guy's too soft for a MAGA America First policy. He's not going to be tough enough on China. But then at the same time, when he tries to, like through this essay, to be extremely tough on China, then how can he have a good working relationship within Beijing? I mean, a lot of people are thinking that he's just going to be frozen out completely, which isn't productive as an ambassador there. So I don't know. He seems like he's stuck between a rock and a hard place. He needs to be tough enough that he can pass Senate confirmation of extremely anti-CCP Senate, but be soft enough from his past that he can have a working relationship in Beijing that's productive. If the Trump administration cares about having a productive relationship with Beijing, it may not.
I mean, I think in Trump's first administration, I think Purdue would easily fit into that, big talk, but then be pragmatic in your actual relations. I don't know in the current situation, though. I mean, I didn't really think about how this pragmatism may make it harder for him to actually get confirmation. I mean, probably you'd have more Democrats voting for him. So you just need some Republicans. I don't know. This is kind of interesting. I mean, I think it works. I think it's very Chinese even to have somebody who is very antagonistic in his talk and then willing to get things done in actions.
That's true. Yeah, maybe they would understand that. That would be like a common.
I mean, certainly, they backed away from it, but the warrior diplomacy was a lot like that, right?
Oh, the wolf warrior diplomacy. Yeah. Yep.
Let's say all these really antagonistic things, but we still want to have meetings. We still want to accomplish some of these things.
Yeah, but I think they had to experience some backlash around that, particularly in their relations.
That's why they backed away from
Asia,
it. Yeah,
that they had to begin backing away.
But I think that they can understand someone doing that.
Yep. One of the interesting things was kind of just the contrast between Purdue and his background as, like CEO, Dollar General, and as a politician later, is the current ambassador, who I wasn't aware of. Because again,
we know people in the Trump administration that we're
going to know like everybody in the Trump administration to the lowest level, where we have no idea, like in a Biden administration. We're honestly in a Bush administration, any other administration. But it feels like with Trump, with wild times ahead, you got to know like every single position within that.
Well, and he doesn't go for typical choices either, right?
Does not go typical choices. So it's always a little more interesting, I guess, reading the backgrounds of these folks. But no, yeah, I mean, Nicholas Burns, who is the current ambassador, is a Foreign Service professional. They actually began as an intern in 1980 in Mauritania and now kind of worked their way up through the State Department and then was nominated. A credible professional with expertise in this their whole career.
Kind of the person you'd want to be
in your sensitive
dealing with a very sensitive relationship.
Yeah. This isn't one of the, I rewarded a big donor. This is like, no, this one's actually important. This isn't like a prize I give out to my biggest donor.
But Trump does not select on competency first.
Yeah, so the biggest prize of France, you saw that went to Jared Kushner's father, right?
I did see that, yeah.
Nice.
That is always one of the biggest prizes. Everybody wants that. That always goes to a donor or somebody connected like that.
Yeah.
So we've saved the biggest win for last. One I probably shouldn't be talking about, but won't stop me.
Future boss, you better be careful.
May let you take the lead on this. So I will just, Trump has said that he will appoint Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense. And he has a very interesting background and one that does not include any qualifications as being the leader of the defense.
I beg to differ on that. I mean, one, he has 2 degrees from Ivy League universities. Come on. They don't just hand those out in cereal boxes. So Princeton, Harvard grad, plus decorated service member within the military.
But retired only at major.
Yeah, that's a high rank. Come on.
Not really.
And he's part of the, seen real stuff, seen combat.
So have a lot of people.
He's one of these desk jockeys. And then most important qualification of all, Fox and Friends on the weekend.
Yeah,
over a decade.
That's not a qualification. Being on TV is not a qualification.
That's a qualification. To our incoming president, that's a major qualification. Very telegenic dude. I'm sure shares a lot of great recipes on Fox and Friends. And more importantly, wrote 2 fantastic books about the key problem. And I think you'll agree with this. Key problem in the military is it's too woke. It's just too woke. Too much of this hippie DI BS stuff. Got to get it out. Women in combat? Nope.
Oh my gosh. Get started on that. I could go on and on about his ideas against women in combat. And there's a lot to go on about Hegseth. One, it's interesting to read about how upset he was because he has the tattoo that was like the Jerusalem cross and the Crusaders.
Crusade cross, yeah. And then Deus Vult.
So he wasn't allowed to go to the Capitol?
Yeah, he was not allowed because he was still a member of the National Guard.
Yeah.
And his unit was called up following January 6th and then the lead up to the inauguration for Biden. And he was screened out because of these tattoos. One, the Jerusalem cross, and the other one, Deus Vult, which is Latin for God wills it, which I believe was said by Pope Urban something or another to launch the first Crusades.
Right. So that was seen as a mark of extremism. And now he has a vendetta against the military for seeing Christian white nationalism as extremism.
Right.
He wants to make the military more white Christian nationalist.
Yep. And I think his reasoning behind that is, one, his experience in fighting in Afghanistan. I think he drew, even though he's very anti-Muslim, and that's pretty well documented, some of the things that he said and wrote about. But the one thing that he did admire in the adversaries U.S. forces fought was that he felt that they gained had a strategic advantage because they were unified by this religious fervor, that they fought harder, and that was a key component of why they persevered against U.S. forces. Now, obviously, that's a gigantic oversimplification of everything. But he took great admiration from that and wants to replicate that we need to have some sort of great unifying force. Ideology driven that. And for him, it is a particular sect of Christianity that should be this unifying force, and feels like all this woke stuff has driven out good, regular white dudes, white Christian dudes that have not been joining the military because of this wokeness.
Yeah, I mean, his brand of Christianity just makes me ill to my stomach. Definitely stands for a lot of things that I don't think are Christian at all, but very particular to Christian nationalism. And then just his adamantness of going after people, anyone who he considers supportive of DEI and this so-called wokeness. I was reading the articles and I was just sitting thinking about my classes, the diversity in them of women and Hispanics and, different ethnicities. Obviously, a lot of white men, mostly still white men. But women are very underrepresented. All these minorities are very underrepresented compared to what they are in the population. But still, you're seeing these at very top leadership positions and how that's what he wants to attack in the military. That's what he thinks there's too much of.
Yeah, to the point where, there's other groups kind of associated with this movement that have put together a list. That's kind of one of the more disturbing aspects. And it's not just like the Defense Department, but it's a bunch of different departments that have been targeted by, groups like Project 2025 and other associated groups, where it's listing individual officers, bureaucrats, and then citing their supposed sin of what they've done, what appearance they've made. And some of them are just pretty crazy. I mean, like one was listed in Politico article. They don't name names, but the list does exist out there. But like one female Navy officer was named because she gave a speech at a 2015 Women's Equality Day event where she noted that 80% of Congress is male, which affects what bills move forward. And then the officer had the gall to say that diversity is our strength.
Yeah, exactly. Something simple like that can get you on this blacklist. 8 out of the 20 were women, even though women are only 17% of the military. So very disproportionately going against women in top leadership roles in the military. When I did Women's History Month and talked to the Secretary of the Army and the Chief Commander of the Navy, Noel Fagan, who I wonder could be on that list. They were talking about why you're only now seeing so many women as generals and reaching this level. And it's because it's just the natural timeline from when women were allowed to fight in combat. And you just didn't see women being promoted to generals or any high-level position when they couldn't serve in combat, how these roles go to combat military personnel. So another way to get rid of women in leadership is to prevent them from being in combat, which is something that Hegseth believes.
Yeah, and it makes no sense just from, we talked earlier in this about the effectiveness of Israel Defense Forces, especially in its strikes on Hezbollah and Hamas in the last couple of months. But that's been forever one of the most integrated. And it was my understanding is the first military to have women in combat roles. And they've certainly proven themselves as extraordinarily effective. So it's not
as has decades of American women in combat.
Right. But even because he's coming back at it from like infantry, ground fighting, hand-to-hand sort of things in those sort of frontline positions. But even in that, like Israeli women have had kind of that sort of frontline position and capabilities and have delivered, clearly.
So one of my coworkers talks about him really understanding the need for women integrated into the army when he was in Iraq, and to talk as they're trying to interact with the Iraqis, get intelligence and do things like that. They needed a woman with them to handle more sensitive issues.
Yeah.
And how they could not have done their job without having women integrated into their units.
Big surprise. Diversity is our strength. Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a lot of consequences for excluding women and ethnic minorities, but he's going after women in particular. So I'm going to say excluding women have this really important role, and diversity really is our strength. It makes us stronger and better and more effective as a military and projecting power and just doing basic activities. I'm going to go on record, Hegseth. Diversity is strength in the military. Yeah. I mean, it is in general, but particularly is, I know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can't help but think, a lot of this does stem from, because it's kind of interesting reading his background. And he certainly started off, particularly when he was serving directly in these operational roles or going to these graduate schools I mentioned at the beginning a little bit in jest. He was very much more kind of we talked about the change within Rubio. Mm-hmm. But he was much more kind of just a pragmatic. During the Iraq surge, he was a big proponent in defense of that, I think within his classes, like at Princeton, and was just seen as a very pragmatic, pro-W, internationalist, traditional kind of Republican foreign policy sort of view. And it seemed like with him, unlike Rubio, which is more political calculation, that it was more personal, like his life fell apart. He went through divorce. He's clearly...
Two divorces.
He clearly has an alcohol problem. And like a lot of people going through these sort of issues, he found direction in this particular version of Christianity, which simplifies the world, to an extreme degree, and has now kind of built his worldview on this extremist form of evangelical Christianity. And its position for women is always in a subservient role.
And this isn't even just your normal evangelical fundamentalism.
It's not, yeah.
This is far-right Christian stuff.
Yeah, I mean, this is specifically
like those tattoos, I think, or one of them at least, was really commonly seen at Charlottesville.
Yeah, I think both, actually. I think both the Crusader Cross and the Deus Vult are fairly common with white nationalists. I mean, that's why it was flagged. I mean, this isn't... Yeah. I know that J.D. Vance framed this as, this is just anti-Christian bias.
Yeah.
These are not common... This isn't just like the cross or something that you got tattooed. This has very specific
like the Christian
meanings.
Normal cross.
Yeah. Yeah, and it does go back. I mean, he is a member. He joined a church, first in New Jersey, but then moved to Tennessee, I think after maybe a second divorce. It's called Reformed Reconstructionism, and it's kind of it's a fundamentalist Calvinist theocratic movement. And it basically believes, opposes all religious pluralism, very core component of the Enlightenment and of the foundation of the United States, and embraces the idea that the nation's founded, that Jesus Christ is the Lord for everybody. So Christianity should be the state religion, essentially. And is kind of this break off of dominionism, which is a certain group of Protestants that kind of take inspiration from Genesis 1:28, which is about God giving people, to be fruitful, multiply, and kind of subdue the earth. And they interpret it as part of this subduing, not only is like control of the environment and all the animals and creatures and whatnot, but also civil society itself. So it's seeking to dominate the culture, the universities, the government, period. So it's all part of this ideology that Christians should seek worldly power, and everything under that should reflect like the glory of Jesus.
One disturbing thing I was reading in the article is that while they don't say the Bible justifies slavery, it's not necessarily against slavery.
Yeah, I read that. That was not great.
So
and then there's this belief that, and again, it's all, and this has been going on since the end of the Civil War, but just reflaming of, the Confederacy. And, this wasn't really fought about slavery, it was about states' rights. And you know what? Actually, slaves were far better off than they were under like Roman slavery or things like that. Like it was this humane institution when every evidence points that it was, a horrific, barbaric institution. Yes. It's unbelievable that this is still being
But they're justifying that. So that's part of his belief system.
Yeah. This to me makes him far more concerning than a lot of other picks that are out there. And I would say, in my mind, more concerning than RFK Jr., which he doesn't cover under foreign policy, but he has some concerning views.
Well, Tulsi Gabbard, who we're not talking about.
Gabbard, we should probably talk about another episode, because she has very similar quasi-religious, she's more of a cult thing based out of Hawaii, but very concerning views, similar in a different way to what we're talking about with Hegseth.
Yeah, that dealing with national intelligence is also...
Not great. Not great. So I would say, those two stand out. Probably Tulsi and Hegseth as ones we're hoping that the Senate will
not confirm.
Will block. Yeah.
But it's going to be hard. There's so many nominees that are being talked about as not confirmable that, they only get one or two.
Up there now. Yeah. If you have two, I'm probably using it for Hegseth and for Tulsi. I'm gonna let Kash Patel go through. Oh no, that could be bad.
Considering that he wants to start with the list of political enemies.
We're too biased towards foreign policy.
I know, right? We're like...
It's like we want to keep the foreign policy as sane as possible. Yeah, because remember, people, that could lead to nuclear holocaust. And we want to... Of all the potential worst outcomes, that's the worst outcome. So let's do whatever we can to prevent that from accidentally happening.
So I think that was a pretty good discussion of some of his main picks. There have been numerous other ones. I think his pick to NATO, I already mentioned that. I was very skeptical of NATO. But these were sort of some of the main that jumped out. I think the one person who we probably could have included and didn't was Tulsi. Yep. But I think this should bring us to the end of this episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kellogglobalpolitics.com and follow us on X at Global Kellogg or me at A.R. Kellogg.
And you can reach us by email, so Nita at kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan, at kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com. As always, please see the show notes for the articles we discuss in this episode.
Thanks
everybody.
Bye.